This is Conspirinormal.
Okay, welcome to Conspirinormal, guys. It's your host, Adam Sane, and Surfiel is here. Welcome back. And we've got an interesting guest for you guys tonight on a rather interesting topic. The whole concept of Memetic Warfare. And that is someone that Surfiel and I, we've made the acquaintance of this gentleman, Jose Herrera. Jose, thank you for coming on Conspirinormal.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Jose, I just, to start off, and this I think will lay a good background to what we're going to talk about. I want to talk about just your background in the military and like where you've served, and we'll just kind of go from there.
All right, roger that. So in 2005, I went ahead and was enrolled in what's called the Pulley program. And the Pulley program was just a kind of like a precursor mentorship process prior to actually going into the Marine Corps. So around 2003, I was sitting at a McDonald's and I was watching the initial invasion of Iraq go down. And I immediately knew that that's what I wanted to do. I always had like this innate urge I was just always attracted to that kind of stuff. The branch of service that I went into was the Marine Corps. I contracted into what's called an O3 contract, which is the O3 subfield, or the military occupational specialty, is known as like infantry guys. So I went to school for an O311, which is a Marine rifleman. And after I graduated boot camp and what they call School of Infantry, which is like a 2.5-month course, I was given orders to the East Coast. I thought I was going to be on the West Coast, but me and about 100 Marines got sent to a unit called 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. And it's known as 2-8 America's Battalion. Around 2006, 2nd Marine Division began to kind of take over operations in Iraq. And my first combat tour was Ramadi, Iraq, in Al-Anbar province. And after that, I did 2 more combat tours. One was the initial invasion of Helmand province in 2009. And then once again into a place called Karizi Saidi, which was in Helmand province. And we called that location Crazy City. And it was called Crazy City because it was one of the most kinetic AOs, or area of operations, of that time period. After getting out September 27, 2011, I kind of had like a rough patch where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. After 3 back-to-back combat tours, I was pretty beat, so kind of wanted to lay low for a little bit. Little did I know that my body was going to kind of break down on me, and it did. And I was forced to change my career expectations. So I enrolled into the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And for about 2 years, I kind of wandered around from department to department until I found my way into the philosophy and religion department, where I ended up befriending the department chair, Dr. George Dervos. There I met Dr. Diana Walsh, formerly Dr. Pasulka, and kind of went under a mentorship with them, and still am under a mentorship with them. And then once again, after I graduated from the PARS department in 2016, I made another decision to go back overseas, but in a different capacity. There was a company that was called Blackwater that kind of had an incident. I think it was Nisa Square in 2007, where essentially a bunch of Iraqi civilians got killed. Well, they ended up doing a name change, and it became ZXE, and then it became Academy. I went ahead and wrote up a bio, sent in my resume, and from 2017 to 2018, I was what you would call a personal security specialist for American diplomats. And I worked both the red zone and the green zone. Did a little bit of work with the Phantom team, kind of doing low pro operations, and then eventually back into the green zone, just protecting American diplomats. After, so I had an experience I had a lot of experiences throughout my time in service, but 2018 was pretty bad in Kabul, Afghanistan. So what the mainstream media doesn't tell you is that around that time period, there was around 14 to like 20 different terrorist cells operating within Kabul city. And Kabul city is an overpopulated city that only has an infrastructure for, I want to say around like 400 to 500,000 people. So every attack that took place within Kabul, it, basically obliterated, a large portion of the population because everything was just so dense. And so I'm not used to, I'm very used to kinetics. Like, it's not a big deal. But I had this little voice tell me, hey, Jose, it's time to go home. It's time to go home. And part of the reason why I went back, because I wanted closure from my last combat tour. A lot of bad stuff went down, and I just kind of wanted to end that chapter of my life. And I thought by going back out there, I might go ahead and find it. What I ended up finding was, the little voice in my head saying it's time to go back home. And so I had the opportunity to come back home. I ended my contract, and I enrolled again back into UNCW. And it was around that time where Dr. Walsh was about to publish her book. And there's a portion in there that she had written about in terms of the sixth sense, or this kind of ability to have this knowing, referencing some of the individuals within her book, and then along with the pragmatic side of.
You're talking about American Cosmic?
Yes, I am. So I'll back it up real quick. So the reason why I got into the philosophy and religion department, and the reason why I pursued the phenomena, was I was trying to find the language or the framework to really articulate what was happening within the operational field and within the veteran demographic side of things, namely suicide. And so everything that led up to 2019, it sounded a bit freaking crazy, man. It was like, and what was crazy about it is that I came to a kind of arc within this narrative in my book, and the underlying factor that's contributing to suicide contagion, or the social contagion within the veteran demographic, has to deal with the psi phenomena. Okay. And that when one of these, so part of the social contagion and the suicide contagion is that the experts will say that there is a complexity of issues that goes with why this is occurring. And I'm making the claim through observations of ontology, quasi-religious properties, and examination of what I would call the weaponization of love, going back all the way to Greeks, formulating this kind of hypothesis saying that there's this kind of metaphysical realm where psi exists in a very pragmatic way, but that there's also a kind of connection, and that once this connection is dissevered, whether it's through a death in a combat or whether it's through suicide, that's why you have the suicide contagion. And what's happening within the veteran demographic is not isolated. It's actually happening all around the world right now. And that's what leads into narrative warfare and memetic warfare. So I created what's called the meta war paradigm. And essentially the meta war paradigm, or at least meta wars, the final form of human destruction. And so our institutions, everyone in the United States is under deliberate attack by these higher forms of warfare. Two, they're very vulnerable and they need to adapt to this new paradigm. If not, we're really going to be in a very bad spot within the next 20 to 40 years. And if you look at the old kinds of propaganda, namely through the defector Yuri Bezmenov, he goes through like 4 stages where essentially in 1985, he did an interview and he stated that at that point in time, the demoralization process, which is like a 15 to 30 year process to kind of undermine democracy or at least embed your agents and do what's called ideological subversion, has taken place. And you kind of see a consistency throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s of this kind of taking place. Like around the 1940s and 50s, when the Cold War began to really kick off, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, was already infiltrated by the Communist Party. And then you had the rise of McCarthyism, which kind of essentially created this fear, this fearful atmosphere where at any one point in time, specific members within the United States government were kind of providing, information to the Communist Party back in Russia. Mm-hmm. And it failed. It failed miserably. And since then, through Yuri Bezmenov's model, demoralization, destabilization, crises, and then normalization, it's all been rooted. And so you have what we call in the memetic warfare aspect a pathogenic memeplex. And I know a lot of folks will say, well, there's nothing really bad about communism or socialism, seemingly that we have programs within the United States that are socialist programs, namely welfare, certain kinds of healthcare benefits, libraries, and so forth. And that's not that those things are bad. It's just that there are some ideas within that framework that become pathogenic. They become viral and they begin to infect. And the people who abide by those ideals end up becoming vectors and spreading, disinformation, misinformation.
Okay. So I'm kind of trying to put my head around this a little bit. This whole social contagion aspect that you're talking about in the use of PSI. So you're basically saying that essentially within warfare, within a group, these soldiers, they can form a bond with each other. And if one later they come home, get back into normal, I guess, quote unquote, normal society, and one of them commits suicide, are you saying that bond is what creates that contagion to occur?
Yes, that's one of them. That's okay. One of the contributing factors. Yeah.
And then is there also an element to there's a lot of, I guess, just like popular conception and mainstream stuff about the theater creating this like heightened sense of consciousness. Are you saying that like Psi is part of that, and that when they leave the theater, then they're kind of disconnected from this kind of more spiritual world that they had, and that kind of leads to a feeling of emptiness also?
Yeah. So one of the let me put it this way. So in terms of narrative warfare, which narrative warfare conceptualizes this idea of identity, meaning, content, and structure. Think of narrative warfare as more so like a strategic story. And that memetics, right, the use of specific units of information, whether it be from pop culture or whether it be from certain kinds of war frameworks, is then disseminated within an information ecosystem. Well, too much of that causes, on top of the pre-existing issues that psychographics and AI machine learning already give a user. So our brains, so the science behind smartphones is like every 15 minutes, your body starts to release cortisol because you really want to check your phone. And that the smartphone kind of acts like a jack slot, yes, or a slot machine, right? And so over
Right.
periods of time, cortisol begins to wreak havoc on your brain. And on top of the psychographic CAI machine learning, narrative warfare, memetic warfare give an individual user or a target population a pretty much steroidal effect. It's like blasting people by allowing the hormone cortisol to go ahead and just essentially just bombard and eventually cause millions of microchain reactions, essentially sequencing, excessive or deficient behaviors, leading to mayhem and chaos. So when cortisol begins to impact your hippocampus, your amygdala, eventually your too much cortisol can shrink the brain, right? And the prefrontal cortex takes a huge blow. And the prefrontal cortex is associated with learning, memories, stress control, and decision-making processes. And so when you're able to subvert the decision-making process of an individual or a target population or even your government, then the mind can no longer function as is. And so what we're really talking about here is just the surface level stuff that we the American public do know about, but it gets into a deeper issue, and that's a philosophical one. And so, as I said before, the meta-war paradigm, which does encapsulate narrative warfare, memetic warfare, has a lot to deal with a lot of the deficiencies and the degradation that's taken place within the Marine Corps specifically. And so I give a kind of narrative where moral incompatibility, essentially moral standards, have kind of transformed into procedural mechanical processes. And when you examine the Marine Corps, it's very Aristotelian in nature. And what that means is to have a virtue ethics system where everything is about balance, context. You can't be too excessive. You can't be too deficient. And in my memoir, I wrote about a specific virtue. It's called Aristotelian friendship. And eventually I translate that as brotherhood or sisterhood. Well, when you dig deep into Aristotle's friendship for its own sake, this construct, there's a metaphysical element. And that's what I say is the driving factor that one allows psi abilities to manifest within the Marine Corps. So when you study the Marine Corps, it takes on these monastic properties, right? And these quasi-religious properties. It's essentially a cult. And so we have doctrine, we have saints, we have a regimen, we fast. And the areas in which we operate are so remote and so isolated that the body essentially cleans itself and there are no toxins that can get in your body. So yeah, you do develop a heightened sense. But just to demystify these processes, pop culture says that, the body has 5 senses, right? And then every once in a while, somebody will talk about telepathy and bring up premonitions or precognitions, and we'll be like, oh yeah, intuition, that's a 6th sense. But in fact, the body has around 21 or 22 different senses. In operations, the way they weaponize psi is they give you a precursor format. And back in my day, it went through several evolutions. And part of that was to keep it out of, the public's eye, but also to go ahead and kind of really hone in on what's allowing psi to take place. And for us, it was called tactical profiling. And then in 2006, it became the Combat Hunter program, where they essentially taught us how to read the human dimension, which encapsulated 6 domains. Those domains were kinesics, biometrics, proxemics, geographics, iconography, and then most importantly, atmospherics. And so what eventually would take place is the combination of these quasi-religious properties, these regimens, the weaponization of love and this doctrine, along with our training, was it would create a synchronicity matrix. And so in my memoir, I write about a specific moment in time where I ended up figuring out kind of this synchronicity, or this kind of connection. The way we operated was in 8-man teams on my third combat tour. So very small unit tactics and operations. And I had a really good friend. His name is Sergeant Garrison, or Joseph M. Garrison. He was killed June 6, 2011. He was killed by an IED. So June 5th, I kind of got these really bad premonitions that something bad was going to happen. June 6th, they became even worse. And then that day, we were after 2 Taliban fighters pushing to a location called Charlie Bravo 22, which we call the playground. And we called it the playground because that's where our gunfights took place. And so we saw this transition of atmospheric exchange. So everything became a ghost town, and we kind of knew that we were going to be in the shit. So the way we operate sometimes, because there's a high IED threat, and IED stands for improvised explosive device. So sometimes we take rat lines and we have to do like this single file line so that the sweeper, who was Danny, it has this metal detector that's able to pick up metallic hits from the ground. And whenever you hit an IED, it kind of gives off a distinct sound. And Danny got a metallic hit. And so our standard operating procedure was, depending on how many guys we have on the patrol and depending on where we're at, you got to set up what's called a cordon or a perimeter. So I went ahead and set a cordon, 180-degree cordon to our rear end. Sergeant Garrison told Danny to push back, and I pushed forward around 10 to 15 meters. Before getting to Sergeant Garrison, the IED goes off and my brother gets blown into a gazillion pieces. I eventually pick up what's left of him. I bring him back. I end up having to call a medevac bird. And this is the moment, whenever we dropped off Joe to the medevac, I pushed back to the perimeter and the bird took off. And as the bird was kind of like disappearing into the horizon, I felt this thing leave my body, like this physical thing leave my body. And for the first time, I never felt so fucking empty. And so for a very long time, I want to say around like 6 years, I thought I lost my soul. And then I entered the philosophy and religion department, met Dr. Pasulka and the project that she was doing. And I began to piece together what had taken place. And so that's how Psi kind of is able to manifest itself within the battle space. Mm-hmm. And so when you come out to, what we call civilian life, you're entering a very kind of epistemic, nihilistic, tribalistic framework. You know what I mean? There's no standard of judgment. No one operates off of a virtue ethics system. It's like a jungle of craziness. And so the rise and the advent of technologies has really alienated people. It's isolated people. The lack of emotional intelligence from younger generations, the lack of sociability, and the rising polarization has created these atmospheres where typically guys who are team guys can no longer reap the benefits of being in sync with one another. And so what the experts call PTSD may in fact be something else entirely, specifically from the psi phenomena point of view. And so my purpose in life is to bring psi into mental health and use it as a framework to deter and prevent suicide and mental health deterioration while reinforcing our institutions with a new paradigm.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jose. And I mean, everyone's familiar with the First Earth Battalion, the men that stare at goats, that kind of stuff, as these, weird theoretical military futures that were proposed, where soldiers would use things like psi. But in effect, you're saying that it's already parts of the military are already pretty much operating on that level.
Oh yeah, we use it all the time, and that's the thing. It's an everyday thing that we use. It's not this, mystical thing that we have to create a doctrine. So the biggest issue, and my book is broken up into 3 parts, and I go into it in the second part, which is what I call a critical analysis of 4th and 5th generation warfighting. And so the war theorists proclaim that 4th generation and 5th generation are kind of obsolete constructs. It's merely prescription. They're trying to prescribe what they're seeing on the ground today. And so what I'm saying in terms of war is that these constructs have been constantly used. So there's different forms of warfare that have been used throughout time and history. And all they're simply doing is being repackaged with technology. And so that's the way, and Psy goes all the way back to, I go all the way back to the Greeks with it. Mm-hmm. That's why, if you do a kind of anthropology with the ancient Greece, like King Philip brought in Aristotle to teach young Alexander school of thought. And somehow that had trickled into, his 30,000 man army of Greek hoplites, which eventually kind of went into the Hellenistic worldview. And not only that, you still had like the Sacred Band, which were 300 male lovers who were the elite warfighting group that kind of brought down the Spartans. Mm-hmm. They weaponized love. I mean, if, the raw aspect of it. And all we've done in the military is simply create a doctrine to create a kind of pseudo raw love, but it's more so a doctrinated love where the same abilities can arise from. Mm-hmm. The problem is that when you're transitioning, let's say from 4th to 5th, with an emphasis on technology, these very ancient or these very holistic or organic properties become procedural to the point where no one can recognize the original reference to why people did that. And so you kind of enter this spectacle or this hyper reality where we lose the original function of why this stuff was even there in the first place. And there's a history about psi and how they're using it now, which it's kind of funny. In mainstream ops, the book that the Office of Naval Research completed in, I think, around 2017, which is called Perspective Taking or Cultural Sense Making. And that's another thing, is that they change the rhetoric, or at least the verbiage, all the time. So you never really know what you're looking at. And so they call it sense making now. And so essentially it's a 23-page manual that highlights things like mindfulness, which goes into meditation, and it encapsulates things like cultural awareness. And so it's essentially the same thing that Marines have been doing and warfighters have been doing since warfighting began.
Right. That's man, that's fascinating stuff.
Well, the main concern would just be like if it works, not necessarily having to understand all the theory behind it in a more like academic sense or something like that. Like if the military is concerned with what actually works.
Yeah, so there's a few things with that. So I have a really big issue with the ethical aspects of teaching people how psi is weaponized. And so in my meta-war paradigm, I have this portion called the meta-human portion. And right now and throughout history, US governments and even just individual actors have used extraordinary abilities to cause harm and chaos. And so if you were to blanket and teach every known person within the United States, this framework, the potential to weaponize it and use it against authorities or use it against the general population would be and could be detrimental. And so you got to be very careful when you tread those lines. And the other aspect is, so I'm going to be very careful with what I say here. So I presented an incident report to include my own thoughts on what's taking place with Psy. And I sent it up to my mentor, Dr. Walsh, and she sent it up to some folks. And essentially, I essentially call out the scientific community by saying the body knows a controlled environment. It knows a controlled lab setting. The only way you're going to figure out whether Psy is legitimate is by actually going into a real-time operating framework, go into real-time ops and test biofeedback, create the administration, and see and watch for effects, because it depends on the real world consequences. And so whether that's ever going to take place, I don't know, but that's kind of my goal as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're in a unique place to really look at the evolution of warfare. And I want to kind of lay down this concept of memetics for people who may not really understand it before we really get into what has happened the last few years with memes and memetics, meme warfare, and what you call narrative warfare and meta war. So what are memes for people who may not understand?
And also to kind of differentiate too, Jose, the idea of but they may not be familiar with these terms, like what kinetic means and the difference between the two.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of kinetics, so the difference between kinetics and non-kinetics. So in typical military operations, kinetics would be things that go boom, like gunfights, bombs, using some kind of physical force. And non-kinetics goes into the frameworks of influence operations and information operations, which kind of breaks down into psychological operations,
okay,
and cyber warfare and all that stuff.
Yeah, I was about to ask you if psychological did fit in that category.
It does, and
it's also part of I guess counterinsurgency operations too, right?
Yes, it is. So typical psyops, what you see in the mainstream is either right before an operation, you'll see a leaflet drop. So they'll send in what's called the C-130, and they'll drop a bunch of leaflets, physical paper memes, trying to convey a narrative that the American forces are good, or that the terrorists or the bad actors are really bad. And so we're trying to influence the local population. And that's kind of what counterinsurgency operations encapsulated, was this hearts and minds aspect to it, which was also, there's a lot of argument whether that worked or not. And the way David Petraeus kind of formulated it was from a French colonialist, David Galula, who, if you do the real hard studies like Sean McFate, in order for coin operations to really work, you really have to decimate the target audience or the population. And, we're a democracy, or at least a constitutional federal republic, whatever you want to call it. And there's just certain things that you can't do in war. So leave it up to troops to try to recondition themselves to do this hearts and minds mission, which has been very, very, very difficult. And so psychological operations not only works in the leaflet capacity, they also use it to essentially blast propaganda. So in my last combat tour in Karizi Saidi, I did some work with some PSYOPs guys. And one of the last missions was to essentially build a schoolhouse for these Afghan kids. The only problem is that you had Taliban units within that area that would come to the little village and do what's called an intimidation campaign. And if any of the kids or any of the families allowed their kids to go to school, the Taliban would kill them. And so after a day of trying to locate an actual teacher and getting into a gunfight, we did what's called a follow-on mission. And PSYOPs eventually just talked a bunch of crap to the Taliban to piss them off. And the reason why we're doing that was so that we could get an emotional reaction so that the following day they would slip up. And if you know anything about war or fighting, you never go into a battle angry. That's where you slip up. And that's what we were trying to do. And that's kind of how PSYOPs works. So if you look at like a case study, there's this culture based off of like the Ashwang, which is like a vampire. And I think it was in the Philippines.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
But the Ashwang is this vampire. So what they did was there was an enemy patrol. They got the last guy. They put 2 holes in his neck to make it seem like the Ashwang vampire bit into his neck. Then they turned him upside down.
Yeah, this was to fight the Muslim, I think, separatists in the South Philippines.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think Edward Lansdale was part of this. Yeah. This is probably like the 40s and 50s.
Yes. And then you get into Vietnam, you see something like that. Well, here's the thing in terms of memetic warfare. We can't really do that against superpowers. So in 2014, President Obama he stopped all combat operations, and we kind of saw this transition within our military efforts or within Department of Defense, where we transitioned into what's called great power competition or interstate strategic competition. Essentially, terrorism wasn't really our main focus point. It was the fact that Russia, China, North Korea, Iran were now able to contest with the United States on a global scale. And those particular countries, fellas, have state-controlled media.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is with state-controlled media, you can't do the exact same thing that's being done to us.
Right.
But I have a solution to that. And I can kind of explain at least a general aspect to how we do that. But before I do that, I should talk about memes a little bit. So memes, or the selfish gene, which was written by Dawkins in, I think, 76, essentially said that genes or memes are like genes. They're replicators. They're all the things that ideas come from. They're the basic building blocks of our brains. And there's benign memes, there's pathogenic memes, and it's essentially a unit of information. If you were to take the Daniel C. Dennett outlook of memes, he would give you a more of an epidemiological virus kind of narrative where memes are like parasites. They're very, very sticky. They attach to a host. And sometimes the stickiness, or sometimes the depending on how dangerous the idea is, it could make you act against your own interest, your own biological imperative. And so he gives an example of a fluke parasite. In order for fluke parasites to live, they have to make their way into like cows and sheep. But every once in a while, they'll transition into another entity. And he gives an example of an ant. Say one day you're in a field, you see some ants, but you see one ant just going up this like leaf, and it keeps falling, but it keeps on climbing. And then you begin to ask yourself, well, what's going on there? Well, the parasite, the flukeworm, has created suicidal behaviors. And so ideas like freedom or communism or capitalism or Islam or truth, those kinds of ideas can make people act against their own biological interests and other interests for other interests. And so depending on the stickiness and depending on the kinds of visuals, the kinds of narratives, and the kinds of things that are attached to those memes, it can make you obsolete. It renders the genome obsolete. But if you took that same framework from Susan Blackmore's perspective, she kind of gives a different narrative. So she takes the same outlook that Darwin, from Darwinism, that natural selection allowed for all these adaptations to take place, which eventually gave life to the gene, which eventually gave life to things like Neanderthals. And then the second replicator, which was artificial selection, the transfer and the imitation of ideas became. So things like making a fire and how to maintain a fire. Well, now that we're in this kind of information age, she kind of gives a different narrative that we're creating what's called teams or tremes, techno memes. But the thing with teams is that very much like humans gave birth or kind of gave way to this second replicator of memes, the techno meme is going to begin to self-replicate its own self, namely AI. And so throughout, Dawkins' time to this time, where Blackmore gives these different narratives, essentially memes are just ideas that build our current world today. And those ideas, if manipulated and weaponized, can subvert an individual or entire populations.
So what is memetic warfare?
Memetic warfare. So memetic warfare is meant to denigrate, disrupt, and subvert the psychological space of a target population. So it's essentially using either a smartphone or a computer or a laptop, or what Major Prosser wrote back in 2008, creating a meme warfare center to disseminate specific kinds of either pop cultural references, crises type memes that kind of give an emotional reaction from a specific target audience or target population. And all those memes, or the bombardment of those memes, comes from either a bad actor or a state power, which uses a very specific strategic narrative. So coming from Mr. Paul Kobal, Special Operations, and Dr. Ajit Maan, who really take the horn on narrative warfare, they give an example of Russia. And so Russia's strategic narrative is this: Russia is still a very decisive, honorable, and strong country, and that the West is immoral, it's divisive, and in decline. And then it can use state-sponsored web brigades or a troll factory to disseminate memes, develop human assets, and use a kind of hybridity that does encapsulate psychological operations, ideological subversion, and memes to sow division or engineer a population to think a certain way. And the sad thing is that our entire cyber infrastructure, with AI machine learning, with psychographics, allows us to be that much more effective. Is that making sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
And of course, the events leading up to the 2016 election that were exposed is really what woke most people up to this, as far as the Internet Research Agency. Can you talk about the Internet Research Agency and what its main goals were and some of its methods?
Absolutely. Before I go into that, I should explain this. So right now, the way that the superpowers are operating is what they call gray zone tactics. And so this is kind of the message for Americans in terms of education. Conventional warfare is kind of inert. Some people say that it's dead. Mm-hmm. And conventional war, where state-based armies go to battle with one another, those days are over. The last declared war was in World War II. Right. And ever since then, we've only had authorized military force. And we've seen major increases within armed conflicts throughout the world. And for the past 20 years, state-based actors have watched and adapted to the Department of Defense. And they figured out that the American military is still superior, so they will not engage us in a conventional format. So everything has shifted below the threshold of warfare. And so they call that gray zone tactics.
Right. Before, in the past, it would have been referred to as like fifth columnism or something like that.
That or Cold War tactics.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about all of this stuff, is that there's so much literature, there's so many acronyms, there's so many prescription-based things that the American people doesn't understand what's taking place. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how we got up to the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. And so around 2013, 2014, there was a series of things that ended up taking place that ended up highlighting the inevitable kind of unveiling of the IRA and what Russia was doing. And gray zone tactics. So Russia plausibly denied that they invaded Crimea. They told the world that they didn't, but yet they had special forces down there, Spetsnaz. Mm-hmm. And what was unique about the Crimea incident was the Russians used what the Americans called the Germazinov Doctrine. And the Germazinov Doctrine is essentially a speech given by General Germazinov, which basically stated, we're going to use a hybridity of tactics and strategies in order to confuse and get our mission accomplished. So they bombarded the Ukrainian Crimean information ecosystem. They engaged with the world through a different narrative, i.e. plausible deniability, and they eventually annexed Crimea. And they took notes from that. And around 2014, they began to hire what you would call as trolls, right? People who are disseminating certain kinds of information, or they're sowing division. Peter Singer and I think Emerson T. Brookings and several other authors make a notable distinction that the IRA were not trolls, that these were sock puppets. And I think the difference between a sock puppet and a troll is that a troll kind of encapsulates internet culture, which is kind of like, that's just a guy making dumb comments. Vice, an actual paid state-sponsored individual that, so the way the IRA formulated was they began in St. Petersburg around 2013, 2014, that hired up to 1,000 individuals. And those 1,000 individuals did several things. One, they developed human assets. They created specific groups that mimicked specific social issues or activist type issues. So, for example, they created a group called Black Matters, And Black Matter's, what was unique about it was the human asset development. So these sock puppets, they made several physical phone calls to individuals, specifically Black owners of businesses, to try and gain more information. And some of the Black business owners, ended up falling for this kind of psyop, I guess you would say. Some people didn't. But throughout every aspect of activism, whether it was from the far left to the far right, the IRA created subgroups and essentially disseminated various narratives, various memeplexes, and it literally sowed division. While on top of that, you had Cambridge Analytica using psychographics to influence the population at large for the Trump campaign. And so...
And before that in Brexit.
Right. So what most people don't know about Brexit was because Russia was using gray zone tactics, they ended up bombing several locations within Syria to displace all these immigrants. And I think it was like 14 million immigrants, which led to specific European countries having to take these refugees in. And with an already pre-existing weak infrastructure, it harbored all this angst, anxiety, and rage. And so it also influenced Brexit. So Cambridge Analytica was doing work in terms of that aspect and also the Ted Cruz campaign, which eventually led to the Trump campaign using Alexander Nix, Chris Wiley, and Steve Bannon to do their work.
And what they would do is that they were just pretty much farming information. So like all those silly quizzes that people would take on Facebook, that's later was determined that that's who was they were behind a lot of those. And that was just a way to just get information about users.
Oh yeah. So the Cambridge Analytica disclosed that, or Christopher Wiley did disclose that within a 3-month span, they had 50 to 60 million Facebook users data points. And a data point, or per individual, they had at least 5,000 data points per individual. And so that means that micro-targeting was that much more effective. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg and company downplayed that those companies or Facebook did not influence the campaign. But that's hogwash, because it did. And hence why we have so much polarization today.
Which they downplayed they downplayed the Russians as well. And that's an important point to remember about all this, is that the Russians are normally blamed, especially by people on the left, for bringing Trump into office, right? But the thing is that, like, and you made an excellent point there, what they were really trying to do was to just cause dissension. So they would make pro Bernie Sanders memes. They would make pro Black Lives Matter memes. And another thing too is that they would actually organize these protests and basically just stir the shitstorm and have an opposing party on the other side of the aisle. So they were they were trying to just cause political turmoil.
Yes, that's exactly what they did. And here's the thing, I think so Facebook never really disclosed what the Russians kind of did. Twitter kind of did in a recent report that's called Grafika, and it gives like this, it's like 100 pages of like highlights from the Twitter sphere and like their analytics and what came of it. And I have some of those analytics that I can read off. But so the IRA reached over, so the Tactics and Tropes from New Knowledge says that they reached 126 million Facebook users, but other references state that they reached 150 million users, but they just weren't using Facebook. It was Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, WhatsApp. And right after the election, so post-election, IRA, or at least bad actors, shifted their focus to the alt-right. So instead of attacking all the groups, they mainly focus on the alt-right. So now the narrative is white supremacy is the predominant threat to American democracy. And a large effort has been made from the Russian standpoint of view on that narrative.
So, since we were the victims of this memetic war campaign from Russia, is their goal, and have we kind of entered like a memetic civil war now? I mean, it seems like even though there's a lot of organic stuff now, it might have got a good jump start, but a lot of the stuff is coming from domestic sources, and it seems like they were really inspired and kind of learned some of these methods from what was being conducted.
Yeah, so I want to say a couple things here. One, the Russians and the American population haven't really figured out the psychological and behavioral drivers to really cause an uproar. And I want to say this. Let's just be thankful that only certain kinds of buildings and certain kinds of damages are being done. If it was more strategic, it would be a lot more lethal. And a lot of Americans don't understand how easy it is to literally take a population off the grid and cause that much more harm. And so that's one aspect of it. So that's kind of me saying that they did a good job, but not the job that could have been done. And maybe that was the point. I talked with Dave Metcalf and another individual named Nate Bacher, and they provide a lot of insight in terms of, misinformation, disinformation, malign information, and these focal points. Is that maybe the point is that it was to bombard the ecosystem in order for it to become self-recurring.
Yeah.
And so that goes back to your point, Sergio, that these individuals kind of adopted but also embraced this mind virus or these mind viruses and really hold it to heart and really think that they're in the right. And so they participate in disseminating more division, sowing more division.
And it creates what you term a corrupted information ecosystem that's now exploited by tons of actors, I guess.
Oh yeah, and that's another driving point that I make is that the meta war paradigm, or at least my understanding of it, is that every American, all 330 million Americans, are now combatants. They are weaponized. They are disinformation agents. And the reason why I bring that up is that it's going to take a high level of accountability and responsibility for people to understand what is actually taking place and what this actually means if memetic warfare and narratives are being used to the point where it does become surgical. And that's what we have to prevent here, is that the moment it does become surgical, we're going to be in really bad shape.
Could you elaborate on that, what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take the QAnon phenomena, for example. I mean, that's like the motherlode of conspiracy theories upon conspiracy theories upon conspiracy theories. Just take a segment from the QAnon branch. If you were to properly infiltrate, send in an agent, whether it's a cyber agent, somebody, a troll or a sock puppet, you were able to disseminate enough narrative and enough memetics, or at least memes, to kind of give an emotional response, then you can practically create an operation where they could actually target, let's say, an electrical grid, a military base, a soft target, things that have like an old folks home really do harm, where it would create or generate an even more fearful atmosphere. And that's what I mean by surgical.
So, in other words, they'd be turning those people onto their own country, essentially, onto its own infrastructure. It's interesting that you say that, because I've heard things like that. I've actually heard that type of thing come from the alt-right.
Well, that's what happened in early 2020 with the whole coronavirus and the 5G. NPR did a story. It was Bobby Allen who did a story where 5G conspiracy theories that were on Twitter mobilized people in England to burn down 4G towers. I mean, if you cut out communications, there goes your logistics, there goes your medical support, there goes your law enforcement. I mean, wow. Serious consequences.
Here's something that I'd like to kind of know, is whether or not this has come into the private sector as well, whether or not these same tactics are being used by corporations. Because, a few months ago, there was a very bizarre thing with Wayfair. I don't know if you remember this, but there began this like huge internet rumor that Wayfair was shipping children in their cabinets. And my speculation almost was just like, what if that was possibly one of their competitors just seeding that idea into people's heads?
Yeah, I get yeah, absolutely. So when you talk about gray zone tactics or great power competition, everything is weaponized. Everything from religion to UFOs to the phenomena. I mean, every aspect of American life is weaponized. And that's the point about meta war. There is no turning back at this point. It is constantly being used, just like that example.
So is there any kind of theoretical way to improve our memetic health, or like vaccinate us against disinformation? I mean, how do you think there's any like realistic thing that we could start doing to educate the public? I mean, I don't know how it could even start now.
Yeah, there is actually. That's kind of one of the so everything for me begins with mental health. So I work with combat veterans. I'm a peer support specialist. I'm also trained in what's called resilience, which is a kind of new mental health tool that's changing the landscape of how we do certain kinds of things and activities, the way we treat trauma within certain communities. And so what this means is, one, I have to have a healthy dose of skepticism. And that means that I have to constantly, at least to a point where I question, why am I having an emotional reaction to a particular thing? And that's the beauty about virtue ethics, is that it allows you to have a framework, but it's mentally gruesome. It requires a lot of mental faculties. Two, you have to have the platforms that surpass psychographics and AI machine learning. And that's the thing about cyberspace, man, and about the internet, is that it has literally become purgatory. There is no forgiveness. And not only that, every individual screen is an individual experience. There is no more shared realities. There's no more shared experience. So everything that you're seeing on your screen is specifically meant for you. And if you're going to bombard an ecosystem, you have to create your own operation. You have to create your own botnet. And I do have some theoretical aspects of how you can do that. But to operationalize this narrative, or at least memetics in the sense of being used for good, let me give you a case study. So Major Prosser, Marine Corps, wrote a paper on Memetic Warfare. And one of the very first defense contracting companies, which was called 3M, used memes to get its workers to produce and be more efficient. And so this stuff can be used for good. Okay, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, you would have to specifically focus on your locality. So by design, you would have to run an operation by measuring bioregional viability, which means what's your physical landscape looking like? What community resources do you have? Do you have any agriculture-based projects within your community? Do you have anything that someone can replace this dopamine or dopaminergic hijack, right? And essentially, I make the claim that we have around 20 to 40 years before we really go into a really major decline. That's what it's going to take, is a 20 to 40 year plan in order to go ahead and neutralize or at least inoculate the American consciousness. Because right now cortisol is through the roof, and it didn't help that we're still in a pandemic, which is built upon pre-existing things. To build on that, or at least share what I have planned. So I'm writing my book for the operational community because they're the ones that are going to understand at least the verbiage at first. But I do believe that we cannot escape hyperreality, right? We have exponential growth. We have new technologies. What we have to do is we have to somehow find a way where we can have the right compatibility between our physical reality and then this digital landscape in order to go ahead and neutralize that. And so that means that you can create a hybridity of ritual-based kinds of therapies with biofeedback type therapies. So for example, imagine if you were to create a kind of wristwatch or a kind of ring where you can measure, you could read your own biofeedback, but you could also read, let's say, your life partner's biofeedback. And let's say you can create a ritual out of that where there is a certain kind of doctrine that you follow and the reason why you do that. One, the very same technology that you're using would be also helping you remain connected in a way that's productive, effective, and doesn't hijack your limbic system. But in order to do that, we have to kind of regress back to a kind of philosophical attitude about who we are as individuals.
Mm-hmm. But we could use this technology to become more self-aware of how other technology is impacting us, to kind of get a hold of it, like someone would use like a fitness app or something like that.
Yes. So that's one of the so I had an opportunity to talk with some Marine Special Operations guys not too long ago, and one of the reasons why I haven't really gone forward with this specific subject is because the fear of being breached. So if you were to breach the data of, let's say, operators or people within this program, it could be used against them. And not only that, if you were to really, so part of the reason why I'm using the biofeedback is because it's also can induce psi, and with the tactical profiling and the kind of classes that I've had, you can also use that to build upon psi. And so it kind of creates this vulnerability for users. So data has to be encrypted somehow. And the servers that maintain that information also have to be protected against bad actors. And so it takes time to develop that point. But yeah, essentially something like a Fitbit could be used, but it has to be encrypted. And there's an individual who can do it. The only problem is it takes money in order to do it.
Right.
And here's another point too. So since we can't escape our exponential growth or technological advancement, Daniel C. Dennett argues that, we can't completely kill, if we were to look at memes as germs, we can't completely eradicate all the germs. It would literally take the salt out of life, because culture is a kind of salt to life.
Yeah.
So it's like damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, especially a place like the U.S. here, where crazy ideas spreading around is kind of a part of everything, and you don't want
American pastime.
Yeah, I mean you don't want it to be too just sterile and. But yeah, that's very interesting.
Well,
here's a hopeful point. So why memetic warfare or narrative warfare and memetic warfare have worked so well and effectively in the United States? It's because we're an experimental democracy.
Yeah.
We're the only people who have been able to go this far and long without having complete government, lockdown on our rights, our belief systems, are the things that we love. And while it isn't perfect, it has given us enough opportunity to go ahead and do some good. And we have to keep working for that narrative.
Fighting for those memes, for the positive ones.
Right.
Because you make a good point that in countries that have state-controlled media, that it doesn't work as well. But since 2016, and it seems like for some of the material that you sent us, that it seems like that there's like now this way to like a way for us to catch up to this in a certain way. Our military, our PSYOPs divisions. Are there any examples of something that could be going on now that might be directed back at these countries?
Let me share two things real quick. So one, so that's the thing about patterns, is patterns tell stories of the past, and everything that the United States has done thus far has been reactive. Mm-hmm. And so by the time we hear about it, our enemies are adapting, and that's the evolution of tactics and war all the time. And so here's the danger. We are now creating a military case system that is becoming increasingly detached from the American population. And very much the same thing is happening with the American population. It has become detached from the all-volunteer force. When the civil-military gap increases or widens, the inability to fight back against these kinds of warfare, or these higher forms of warfare, become increasingly difficult. And the thing is that not even the DoD has the right narrative to properly fight back. And that is one of the mission, or at least the goals to do this, is to get this to the operational community so that they can adapt to it. Now, here's the upside to it. In 2019, every armed forces branch has now begun to kind of create a cyber capability. And sometime in 2021, they're going to send these kinds of capabilities out maritime-wise, geographically, and they're going to hone in on potentially, bad actors who are doing this kind of work. And that's the thing, is that the American military cannot conduct cyber operations within the United States. It's against the law.
Yeah.
But we've done it before, and a good case study of it is Operation Gloom Symphony. And it's how a joint task force with the NSA and DoD brought down the cyber caliphate of ISIS. And so we kind of have a theoretical framework and an operational framework to target pathogenic meme plexes like ISIS and bring them down to a neutral point. But the problem is that there's still a lot of gimmicky aspects to that operation and the kinds of equipment being used. I mean, so it takes years. So if the military is going to phase out a particular, let's say, mechanical vehicle, they're going to be phasing out the CH-53s with the V-22 Ospreys. Marine Corps wide, that takes at least 2 to 4 years. Mm-hmm. And that's not including the tens of thousands of Marines that they have to train, from the mechanics aspect of it to the flight aspects of it to the operations aspect. It is a very difficult thing to try to transition and adapt to these new kinds of tactics, but it is being developed.
So we already know that the Russians and possibly other state actors are doing these warfare against us again now with the 2020 election. We already know that this is happening. In 2016, there was something happened where the idea was that if Trump did not win, then they were gonna sow a lot of discord in this country. That was kind of their goal. That was their kind of contingency plan, was to sow even more, probably get us to the brink of like civil war. And that's in that report that you sent me.
Yeah. So I've had this discussion. The Civil War would be very lame. No one has. I mean, it's not like the current conflict that's taking place in Armenia, or Pakistan and Armenia, where they're now using drones to essentially take out particular objects, and drones capabilities are far and wide. Honestly, the left versus the right, I would hate to say this, but it would seem that conservatives have a lot more weapon systems. And I think too, the real patriots would say no, absolutely not in this country. We have fucking fought and bled in too many fucking wars for it to go down, because the IRA, the Russians, have focused their narrative on white Caucasian people and the alt-right. It's not going to happen like that.
So you think the idea is just a meme itself? The idea of some real American Civil War. I guess the boogaloo is like their catchphrase, things like that.
I would never say never, but to the point where it's a full-blown, Civil War 2.0, no, it's not. What you're going to have is individual actors or specific populations probably do some harm to other populations, right? So if there are protests, that's where it's going to happen, what we've seen so far. But no Civil War 2.0. And federal forces would hone in on that. I mean, I think at that point, knowing our, I want to say NSA capabilities, but at least our cyber capabilities, that we could stop any kind of militia doing some kind of harm to another group.
But pushing that idea and pushing that meme is, I guess, pretty useful for whoever's trying to sow division in the U.S.
So this is what I say to that. The invasion is not physical; it is psychical. Okay, so first off, like if you were to like China, for example, China owns major metropolitan properties They own a large portion of Hollywood. They own a large portion of agribusiness. They've created the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're literally creating new economic feedways back into China. Why would they want to waste? No one, those people have been suppressed for so long. They don't want to fight us.
Yeah.
This is to undermine U.S. influence so that they can take over strategically, economically. It's about markets.
The same with Russia, too. It's just about kind of encouraging a U.S. isolationism or something like that that allows them to grow their sphere of influence that they believe they're entitled to from history.
Oh, yeah. And Russia's in decline, man. They have a huge population decline issue taking place right now. Their oil fields, Russia's a gas and light company with a standing army. It's throwing Hail Marys right now at us. But we're also developing new capabilities that can undermine core superpowers. I hate to say it, and it's sad, but the weaponization of space is one of those hopes where we gain the upper hand. And if you really study like the Marine Corps Futures Directorate, there's several case studies. So this is how DoD has been operating for the past decade or so. They hire creative writers or strategic group think tanks that focus on science fiction. And they hire these people to write out potential futures.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what I'm doing with my book as well, is an influence tactic to make it seem like these are very real things, and they are, but they're good memes. So if you look at the Marine Corps Futures Directorate for 2030, 2040, there's a scenario in there that very much looks like what the United States is currently in. And that means that we're kind of focusing on the inward degradation that has taken place, while superpowers are undermining our influence and taking over markets. And there's a lot of individual businesses that have enough capital right now that are fighting to deter that scenario. The impending aspects, or at least the kind of things that I would worry about in terms of the future, is mainly focused within water, food, and energy, and overpopulation of metropolitan areas. And here's the thing, fellas. When you talk about narrative warfare, memetic warfare, psychological operations, you got to think of it this way. If I want to target a specific population that is unpredictable, that is chaotic, and that would do the most damage, you know what population I would target?
What would that be?
The young adult, or what the Marine Corps Futures calls youth bulges.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're the most hormonal. So that's who we got to protect the most out here, is that age group. And so my day job is working with middle schoolers and high schoolers in order to educate them about these kinds of realities and assist them in cultivating good mental health practices within the school system. And so that is one aspect in which we can kind of assist our fellow countrymen. But you can also do the exact same thing to the core superpowers. It would just take a lot more effort in terms of undermining them with what they're doing to us.
Well, I'm glad you have some hope, and I'm glad there's some kind of prescriptions that we can start on, because it's looks pretty bleak.
It was seeming pretty dire there for a second there, but you actually do seem to have some hope for the future, so that's good.
That's a part of. So I'm a U.S. Marine, man. I don't, I have 4 tours under my belt. There's no such thing as defeat
Yeah.
in my playbook or in my literature in my head. I don't stop until I'm freaking dead. So, this is a lifelong project that will continue. And I simply will not accept defeat. I will not accept that my fellow Americans or my countrymen and my countrywomen fall victim to these very, very bad things.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. Not on my watch.
Amen, brother. I like that.
Thank you.
I like that a lot. So we mentioned it briefly, but the Thomos project, kind of to talk about that just a little bit, where people can find that.
Yeah, if you go to www.thumosproject.org, you'll find the website. Thumos Project, Thumos meaning energy, spirit, and honor. It was founded by my mentor, Mark Mosier. Mark served, I think, a little over 30 years within the Marine Corps, the National Guard. Spent most of his time within the infantry field, reconnaissance and forest reconnaissance. And the initial inception of it was to kind of assist transitioning veterans out into, civilian life. But now that I've kind of taken over it, we're developing the framework where we can utilize what I call agritherapy and the domains, or at least the administrative aspects that built us up from. So there's a lot of training that went into guys like me and a lot of other veterans that have very similar practical applications in building one's resilience, or cultivating one's resilience and mental health. And we do that by combining it with some kind of agriculture-based project. And so that's kind of the initiative that's undergone thus far. Took a big blow when Hurricane Florence hit. We were trying to grow our own hot sauce, and I lost quite a bit of money when Florence hit. But we're slowly but surely getting back up and back into the fight in that kind of an aspect.
Very, very nice stuff. Also, you have to tell me, because we talked about this a little bit when we were chatting, how you got the name Lawani.
Lawani, yeah, I'll tell you that story. So right after my good friend, Sergeant Garrison, was killed, I kind of got put down for about a week and a half. And when they released me, they attached the British commando with an Army PSYOPs team and then a Special Forces Afghan group called Tiger Forces. And so for like the first couple missions, I had to do these like silly missions where I had to go find teachers for this school that we were supposed to build up for these kids. One day, we had transitioned onto what's a route called Route Bats. We named all our routes after animals. And on Route Bats, we found this particular hut. And the guy happened to be a teacher, so the Army PSYOPs guys and the Tiger Forces had gone in the back to drink Thai and break bread with the guy. And so I set up security cordon in the front. And the guy, Ryan Whitlock, who I'm still friends with, who's in the UK, we start talking, and he starts telling me the story about how he's in Sierra Leone during the Civil War. But as he's talking, he starts taking off his helmet, man. And I tell him, I was like, hey, man, you don't want to do that. And as soon as he takes it off, this sniper from about 200 meters away fires around, and it misses his head. And all you hear is like, oh, shit. And, next thing you know, we're all online just blasting this little area. We call them beaver dams. And beaver dams are these kind of like homemade resting areas with shade. And so the sniper team had set up, this Taliban sniper team sat up like 200 meters south of us. And so as soon as, we returned fire, My second team leader, or my first fire team leader, because at that time I had taken over the squad, we break up into two maneuver elements, which is called a satellite element or maneuver. So it's two teams that are separated with like a distance between like 100 meters or so. And we start to pursue the Taliban that had taken shots at us. So the Taliban had so their tactics were to shoot at us, like harass us, and then evade to catch us into the open. And in Karizi Saidi, there's a lot of farm fields that are open. And as soon as we hit this specific area, the Taliban sniper team just opened fired on us. And, the way we operated back then was very, very unusual. We didn't take cover. We didn't jump down to the ground. If you didn't get shot the first time, then you just keep on moving, keep on running and gunning. And so I just start shooting across the field, and you see to the left, the Army PSYOPs team, the Tiger forces, literally eating dirt because they're getting shot up. And I'm yelling at them to get the fuck up and move. And they're just looking at me like I'm freaking crazy as I'm firing over their heads. Eventually, we end up pursuing the Taliban, but they end up getting away. And these guys, man, they were messed up. Like one of the Army PSYOPs guys twisted his ankle. They ran out of water, so we had to return to base. So later on that night, we had to do the follow-on mission with the PSYOPs team. And so right before that mission, I had set up a security cordon, and Ryan, the British commando, had come up to me. He's like, Josie, the guys, they want to call you something. They want to name you something. And I'm like, yeah, what's that? And they're like, they want to call you Lewana. I'm like, what does that mean? He's like, it means crazy. Because you're fucking crazy, man. You're fucking crazy the way you guys did all that. And I was like, we told you, fellas. And so that's how I got that name, Lewana, crazy man.
Cool.
Nice. Good story. Jose, tell people where they can contact you. This has been excellent, man. Thank you so much. But where can people contact you?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook under Lewana Herrera. Or if you go to my website at Jose Herrera 03xx.com, you can send me an email and I can write you back. And that's where you can find me.
Excellent.
I just wanted to thank you for coming on, and I think you really provided some perspective that people need, and can help them understand the current environment that we are all in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with that 100%. It's a really crazy world, and people really need to understand this as well. So, all right, Jose, stay on the line for us. We're going to close out this section. We'll be back to close out the show, as always, on Conspirinormal. Welcome back, guys. That was a great interview. I know that we had originally were going to speak about the meme or Memetic Warfare, which we did, and we did at length. But it was also fascinating to get into the whole psi aspect of it. And I had no idea, even though we really kind of met Jose through David Metcalf, I had no idea that he knew Diana.
I did.
Okay.
I didn't know that he actually was in her department.
Yeah. Yeah, I had no idea. So it's interesting that we did this interview because over the last couple of days, I watched a documentary. It's actually a 4-hour documentary called Agents of Chaos. And it was about this subject, about the IRA, the Russian, or as they call it, the Russian troll farm.
Mm-hmm.
And I highly recommend that documentary if you really want to understand this and what went on. And today I had a look at some of the material, one of the materials that Jose sent us, which was the Tactics and Tropes of the Internet Research Agency.
Yeah.
And I looked at a lot of these memes that they put out. And
did you
seeing,
recognize them?
I can remember seeing quite a few of these, actually.
Oh, yeah.
There was one that I saw that was on there a lot. It was like one of those, like, you know, if you don't love Jesus, don't share. If you do love Jesus, share. I saw one of those. A lot of stuff that plays on religion. What I was really surprised to see was that there was a ton of stuff that had to do with like Black Lives Matter type of material.
Yeah, I remember seeing a few of those and the more like the Afrocentric theme stuff too. And
yeah.
I remember seeing a couple of those. They were familiar. But all the like right-wing patriot ones, I recognized a whole lot of those.
Yeah,
even though
I recognize a lot of those too. What does that say about the friends we have on Facebook?
Or friends we had on Facebook.
Friends we had on Facebook, yeah. So, yeah, there was just a ton of them that I did recognize and that I had seen, and kind of, you know, honestly, at the time, I'm always kind of suspicious about these things because they're so simplistic, and they just boil things down to just like one simple thing. I mean, that's what a meme is essentially. But like, you know, a good example of one of these, like kind of the Afrocentric ones, was you got a picture of like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and they're like, you know, superimposed on like little girls in dresses, and it says, "Do not vote for oppressors." And then it has a picture of an African American, I guess he's a teenager or a young man. It says, "I won't vote, well, you." So this is just essentially, you know, encouraging.
They were just trying to get Trump elected, so they didn't want African Americans voting.
Vote.
Period. Yeah,
right. That's all that shit is, and you're seeing that kind of the same thing now. Too. I'm not this. This one was funny with the Bozart one. That was interesting. But you're seeing that same type of thing now. That they're really pushing, like trying to push that whole third-party candidates. And I actually went and voted today, and Kanye West is on the Kanye West is on the ballot in Tennessee. Which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, well, it's a free country.
It is, but it's obvious what's going on there, you know. And yeah, here it is, the picture of Jesus. It says, "Like if you believe, keep scrolling if you don't."
It's got an X on his face.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. I remember seeing the one with Yosemite Sam that says, "I was banned from television for being too violent. Like and share. If you grew up watching me on television, have a gun and haven't shot or killed anyone." So these type of just appeals that are just to like, and they're using those just to just show how they have are appeal to so many different types of groups.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just one type of thing. The Second Amendment is my gun permit. That was another one. So, and then there's an interesting one on Texas secession. Or Texit. So, yeah. Which is something that comes up time after time.
What I really liked about what Jose said tonight about Russia in particular, though, is that these are the dying gasps and of a society that's demographically declining, politically declining, and from the left a lot, you get this image of this big, powerful boogeyman, And it's good to think that it's not necessarily that we're not dealing with such a powerful adversary, obviously.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly like, it's not like our sun is setting and theirs is rising. That's the narrative that they are pushing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily either that they're the good guys or they're the defenders of Western civilization or of Christianity either. So, yeah. So, anything else other points you want to make, or?
Yeah, it's just having, we've talked a lot about more historical conspiracy aspects of fourth generational warfare and things like that, and how it's played out, how it does relate to the now, but to have someone with so much experience, in actual theater of war and understanding of the evolution of war and how it actually works on the ground, how it's working on the ground now that this information war has been brought home. It was just real. It was very informative. I hope everyone gets a lot out of it.
Yeah, same here. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, Patreon, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/Conspirinormal. YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast, that is there. Please leave us a 5-star review. We don't get enough of those on iTunes. That really helps us as well. The usual podcast spiel. And guys, we're going to be back with some more interesting guests on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.